Welcome to Season 5 of Your Bird Story, a podcast about everyday people and their relationships and interactions with wild birds. I'm your host, Georgia Silvera Seamans. Hi listeners, today I'm here with Jenn Lodi-Smith. Jenn is involved with the Spark Bird Project, and I'm going to ask Jenn to introduce herself.
Hi folks, I'm Jenn and I am the founder and director of the Spark Bird Project, a social science, community science initiative designed to collect, study, and share the stories of how people fall in love with birds. And from that entry point of the stories of our Spark moments, look at the variability in birding, looking at how birding changes over time, everything from career trajectories to intergenerational connections, and how our community and our society appreciates birds, giving that knowledge that we learn from the project back to our community partners so that they can inclusively spark and sustain more and more people who appreciate and care for birds to the benefit of the birds and those of us who love them.
Okay, that's a complex project. What sparked the project?
Oh my gosh, this is one of my favorite stories to tell. So I was not a birder. I was always sort of vaguely bird curious as a child, had some near misses of becoming a birder, exposure to birds in the natural world through my parents hiking the Appalachian Trail and birds in the backyard, things like that. But really was rather naive to what was around me. And it took having kiddos to awaken me to the natural world, to spark my own curiosity. My older kiddo, nature in general, and then my younger kiddo, birds in particular. And I asked a colleague who is an ornithologist for advice on what to do with my young kiddo and her interest in birds, fully expecting it to be the thing that I then had some random information about, and she moved on from a few minutes later, and instead found it transforming our entire family. We went from having a rudimentary pair of binoculars to everybody having their own binoculars to everybody having a ridiculous amount of facts and trivia and knowledge and interest and passion, something that we do together as a family. The grandparents got in on it. Everyone started doing it together. And one of the biggest recommendations that my ornithologist colleague, shout out Sarah Morris, recommended was that when the kiddos were old enough to go to Hog Island Audubon Family Camp. And if listeners do not know, Hog Island Audubon Camp is an absolute treasure of a place. Most of the camps are designed for adults, and everything from art to mindfulness to field ornithology to safe spaces for different folks in birding. And one of their signature programs is a family camp where you get to go and spend a week with your family eating amazing food and not having to think at all about what is being cooked and experiencing the nature of this beautiful little island off the coast of Maine, taking the boat to see the puffins and seeing all the warblers and other songbirds that are living on island, the ospreys, the eiders, and just connecting with other families who are like-minded, and an incredible team of staff and educators who are there to help you absorb all of the nature that you could possibly want. And while we were there, standing, waiting for the puffin boat, I complimented the director at the time, Eva Lark Matthews, on her tattoo. And she said, "Thanks, they're my spark birds." And I had never heard this term before. I had no idea. And I just, making small talk kind of way, said, "What's a spark bird?" And she told me, and I was fascinated. So for the past 20 years, I have been studying identity development and how people come to know who they are, that lifelong discovery of ourselves. And to find that this community that had come to mean so much to our family had a shared narrative around how they fell in love with birding, I was completely fascinated. I'd been looking for ways to sort of give back to the community and, volunteering, but I also wanted to use my 20 plus years of social science or data analysis or something in some way, and really just hadn't found exactly the right fit. Like maybe I could do personality in birds or something like that. It wasn't sticking. But when I went to go read the literature on spark birds and went to Google Scholar very dutifully as an academic and found that there really wasn't academic research on the topic, and that there wasn't even a repository where I could go and easily read sparkbird stories, right? There's an episode of This American Life. I could read folks who had made it enough to publish their memoirs. That was great. But it wasn't the general birder. It wasn't the general field ornithologist, right? It was a very, sort of select group of stories. And so that's really was the spark for the Sparkbird Project. Was I wanted to create a space where those stories could be shared to give a voice to the everyday person who loved birds, as a space for us to learn about each other. So in reading each other's stories is such a human process, and hearing each other's stories, as you know with your podcast, is really one of the few spaces where that gets to happen. And it's so exciting to hear those stories and get those lived experiences. And then we add on the social science aspect of learning from those stories, of learning from the other data that we collect from our spark birders, asking them about who they are, how they bird, and looking at that variability among birders at one point in time and now over time as we follow up with all of our spark birders.
Okay, so I have heard of Hog Island, and I didn't know there was a family component. Mm-hmm. Sounds very exciting. Also, the puffins and the fact that someone else makes your meals.
Yeah. Oh, it's so great not to have to think about it. There's also a teen camp. I forgot to mention teen camp. So for teens out there.
So who are some of the partners that you work with?
Yeah, so really one of our biggest partners is the Roger Tory Peterson Institute. It's a art museum and a nature hub in Jamestown, New York, which is sort of at the farthest westernmost tip of New York State. And they are the legacy of Roger Tory Peterson, who, if listeners are not familiar, is the person who really created the modern field guide and took it from a concept, an idea that a few folks had sort of played around with, to something that was mass-produced and in everybody's pockets, and really democratized birding in the early to mid 1900s. And so his illustrations, his art, his expertise as bringing birds to the everyday person is held at the Peterson Institute, along with rotating exhibits of beautiful artwork celebrating his legacy as an artist, bird art in particular, but art with a conservation focus in general is really important. And so they have been really one of the most enthusiastic supporters, and part of the reason why the project went from an idea in my head that felt like something that was just for me to seeing that as a possibility that had potential for helping them learn more about who birders are, particularly who bird artists are. We've also been working with some of our local groups, Buffalo Audubon Society, New York State DEC. They've been really helping us collect stories through some of their birding challenges, which has been a wonderful way to get people to share their story. And then the great folks at Birdability, who are doing such great work to make birding accessible for everybody, as they say, and bringing in that the real benefits of birding for us as humans and the opportunities to make birding more accessible, more inclusive spaces. There are others, but those are the ones that have really been the most active this past year or so.
Okay. I wanted to ask about the state's role through the DEC, and can you talk a little bit more about those bird challenges? I'm based in New York State, and I have to admit, I didn't know about those.
Yeah, so the iBird New York Challenge is something that is run by the DEC, sort of in partnership with their birding trails. So there's a network of, they're not like the only place where the birds show up, obviously, but places that are designated as good spots to go and meet more of your birds. And it's designed to get folks introduced to birding, getting them engaged with birding, learning some of the basics, and then building their skills through the iBird New York Challenge. And then we have a local one that Buffalo Audubon does in partnership with a group called Outside Chronicles, which also runs a hiking challenge. And so they get people out doing different hiking spots, and then they've translated that into birding as well, where you try to see a certain number of ducks in a day, right, for the winter challenge, things like that. And other things are, doing something conservation related, like drinking bird-friendly coffee, sharing your Sparkbird story, stuff like that. Lots of fun ways to get people engaging with and thinking about birds in different ways.
You mentioned birdability and the inclusion of everybody.
Yeah.
I'm curious if some of your partners are specifically focused on underrepresented groups in the birding space.
That's one of the areas where I'm really excited to start building some partnerships. And if anybody is listening, wants to work in that space and do some targeted recruitment to try to understand specific groups and specific individuals, I'm heading into my sabbatical year, and that is absolutely one of my number one priorities. And that's really driven by the energy and effort and interest of our community partners. So for example, with birdability, we've been asking about neurodiversity and asking people to self-identify the ways in which they are neurodiverse. And so being able to understand neurodiversity and the strengths that neurodiverse individuals bring to birding is one of the priorities that we're hoping to build.
What are some of the early findings from your work? I mean, you're a social scientist, so I know you're probably really focused on that in addition to the birds.
People always ask me, like, what papers are you going to publish off of it? And the papers are definitely they're going to come, but they are not as much a priority because I have the privilege of being a full professor, having a long-time tenure track position. The cost of the project is relatively, it's just my time, and it's what I want to do with my time. I have a lot of autonomy to choose how I spend my time. That will come. What I can prioritize right now is building a really representative sample so that I know when we do move forward with publication of results, I can have confidence in what we are publishing. But what we are learning so far, and with the hard caveat that we are a little over 200 stories right now, our participants, because we've been working particularly with these local community partners. For example, the most common sparkbird right now is the northern cardinal. And when I talk to folks in Arizona, they're like, we don't have northern cardinals. Whereas I was just talking with somebody earlier who is from California. Their sparkbird is a hooded oriole. There are no hooded orioles represented in our data set so far. So broadening, getting more stories from more people will help us build better knowledge, because people want to know what is the most common sparkbird. But really what our data shows so far is that the birds are all over. Like, you get your taxonomic checklist of birds for your region, and the bird's going to be on there. And it's also spark people. The interpersonal connections are present in more than 2/3 of the stories that we have so far. Now, that is totally possible that it is because those are the people who want to share their story, right? That there's some sort of sample bias. So if there's some folks who are super introverted and have been really hesitant about sharing their story and they don't have a spark person, please share your story. The more stories we have, the more representative and the better the conclusions we can draw. But those interpersonal connections, the spark people, the grandparent, the friend, the teacher who gets us out birding and helps us notice the world in different ways is absolutely one of the key findings so far. The other key finding is access to resources, and this is where working with community partners is going to be really, really critical. Access to field guides, access to binoculars, access to feeders, and access to travel and opportunities to see birds and notice birds. And the birding community, having access to that birding community, knowledge that that birding community even exists. A number of our Spark Bird stories say, I didn't even know that there were other people like me, and I found them. And then making sure that that's a welcoming space. Those are all really key. And then there's more psychological aspects, the curiosity, the wonder, the childlike thirst for knowledge that so much in our society often taps down in our modern world. And it's not cool, and it's not what we should be doing. And instead, in the birding community, it is enthusiastically endorsed that we ask questions and that we are curious and that we can all learn from each other in different ways and intergenerationally and across different spaces and different places and different modes. And so I think those are really at the heart, along with the fact that these experiences are tremendously positive. So we ask all of our participants to rate. This is sort of a standard protocol with all self-defining memory research that we've adapted from Jefferson Singer's work. And they endorse positive adjectives of joy and happy, inspiring. But there are some negative adjectives in there as well from those experiences where birds help us through difficult times. And those are really, really powerful, beautiful stories.
Do you collect location or geographic data? So are you finding that the folks who participate, maybe more people who live in the suburbs versus people who live in cities and might bird in their local park because they don't have access to a backyard like me?
I have not looked at that yet. We are collecting zip code. And so eventually, once we scale up and have more data, we can do things like map out closeness to green space. And if there are any data folks out there who want to do those sorts of analyses, please reach out. Really, what's at the heart of the project from a scientific perspective is creating a data resource that is really grounded in the best practices of open science, where other scientists can come and ask questions that they might be interested in as well.
Yeah. Do you have a couple of favorite spark bird stories that you're okay with sharing with us?
Yeah, sure. Oh my gosh, I have so many favorites, and folks can read many of those stories, not all of the stories, but most of the stories, if participants have given us permission, are published on our website at spark-bird.org. And if you want to go read more and enjoy those, that's where they are. We also have some on our Instagram space. So it's hard to pick, but I'll pick a few. First is Roger Tory Peterson's Spark Bird story. So he has sort of the characteristic, quintessential single bird, single moment type story. And so this is sort of the archetype story of being a child, seeing a bird. He reached out his hand to touch it because he thought maybe it was dead, and he was a good, curious nature nerd kid. And so he reached out to touch it, and it flew up in this flash of golden wings. And it was, of course, a northern flicker for anybody trying to guess the bird species. And it was a pivot moment. It was a turning point for him where he really became fascinated by birds in particular and bringing those into his artwork. And so that sort of Petersonian story is, I think, what most people think of when they think of a spark bird story. And I have people who tell me, well, I don't have a spark bird. I have these sort of series of events, or I have multiple spark birds. And so we're also really interested in getting those stories of that gradual trickle of, when I was 5, I remember my grandmother having feeders, and then in my second grade classroom, and then when I was in high school, and then I took a class in college, and then my job had me noticing birds and teaching other people about birds. And so that gradual progression into an appreciation of birds is very much, just as much a spark bird story as that one moment in time that is just mind-blowing. We also have people who have birds as stories that have helped them through difficult times, or stories of grief and loss. My co-host on the Sparkbird podcast, she was in a cemetery remembering her father, and she saw a beautiful great egret. And we have stories across the lifespan. So my daughter's story is, I don't remember a time I didn't love birds. I have always loved birds. Her mentor, Sarah Morris, talks about being 7, and her stepdad got a Peterson Field Guide under the tree, and she would sneak down and look at it, because they had this tradition where you had to keep your gifts under the tree until all your thank you cards were written, which is a great tradition. And then she was mentored by other people. Then we have participants who come to birding in young adulthood, in midlife. One of my favorites is a retiree who is sitting on his porch drinking his morning cup of coffee, and a kingfisher swooped in and grabbed a fish and sat on a branch and started beating the out of the fish. And he was so excited by seeing this really cool behavior and noticing that behavior. And then he started noticing it day after day. He would watch this bird, and then that got him looking at other birds. And the other ones that sort of weren't part of my sphere of understanding, that the Sparkbird stories have really opened me up to, are people who notice interesting sounds. So behaviors and sounds. And I was not a particularly sound auditory focused person, and now very much am. And those stories, and of course the birds themselves, have helped push me in that direction.
Thanks for sharing those with me. When you talked about Roger Tory Peterson, his story as being sort of the one that maybe people think is most closely associated with this idea of sparkbird, it made me think of people whose stories about their relationships with birds don't get talked about, or aren't necessarily recorded at all or in full in history. I spent 2 weekends ago in Cape May, which was my first time. And after leaving Cape May, that was when I learned that Harriet Tubman had worked in that town, and she used the money she earned to pay for her work rescuing enslaved people. And she's mostly associated with the barred owl and all of that owl. And, I just always wonder what bird, or how was her interest in and use of bird behavior sparked? And that's a story that we don't have.
I think a lot about those stories that can't be told anymore. We have a student who is going through historical published memoirs, historical records. We also, through some social media posts where people share their stories. And we also have an opportunity for people to leave legacy stories. So if you know a story that is not written down and you want to share that, whether that's for a friend or family member or a historical account, participants can share those through the platform as well.
It sounds like your family is an intergenerationally birding family.
Yes.
How has your birding changed as a result of your children's interest in birding, and then what of your parents' relationship to birds?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great question. I think it's one of the things that has really profoundly connected our family in many ways. My mom is a retired veterinarian, and she got to spend a couple weeks actually, studying raccoons on Assateague Island off the coast of Virginia while she was in vet school. And for folks who don't know, like me, back in the day, Assateague is a huge stopover migration place. And so she got to see all of these amazing birds and had her field guide with her, but had this focus where she had to be studying these raccoons. They were doing airdrop baits of rabies vaccines. And so, she was able to do some birding, but it didn't hook her at that time. And so we were sort of around it. When I really first started birding, it was to support my kid. I was the chauffeur, I was the helper, I was getting that knowledge to build them. And there was a moment when we were walking along as a family, and I noticed that I wasn't thinking about work. I wasn't busy in my head with conversations or data analysis. I was just in the moment appreciating the birds and appreciating being with my people. And that was magic. That has literally transformed my life and the direction of my scholarship and just my own health and wellness. We started our local Young Birder Club to help allow opportunities for other families in particular and young birders to come into some of the opportunities. Not everybody has an amazing ornithologist in their pocket, and we see that as a real privilege. And so we try to share that with other folks, buying binoculars, buying field guides, buying bird books as gifts. My parents, my mom and my stepdad, came to Hog Island with us. In subsequent years, they are very engaged in birding and do that on their spare time as well. And during the time that our bird interest was growing, my dad was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and he had just started noticing owls that lived in his backyard, and that always feels like a very special connection to him. He never knew about the idea of this project. It happened after he passed. And I always feel that deep connection to how much he would love what we're doing in this project. So there's really many ways that birds connect our family. And I think it's a great example of how birds connect us as people, whether it's a stranger that we meet out in our patch and ask, oh, what are you seeing? Or showing somebody new a bird that they might not have noticed before. I think birds really are absolutely a connector.
I'm sorry to hear about your dad. Are you going to leave a legacy story of his?
Oh, I totally should. Yeah, I should. He'd gotten really into the screech owls that lived in his backyard and was looking forward to learning more. So we're doing that for him.
I have a final question. So we're sort of living in this time where we have lots of information about the ways in which that all of us live is impacting bird populations, sort of bird declines across the board. And I'm curious how you see this project, the connections between it and bird conservation.
I think it's such a great question. I think it's critically important when we talk about creating bird-friendly spaces that we also are thinking about the ecology of the people who are in those spaces. We know that birders vote. We know that birders engage in conservation practices. We know that they donate to bird conservation organizations. We know that they volunteer and they care. I'm sure there's some who don't, but the vast majority of them do. And by sparking new birders, by sustaining the birding community that we have, and by really leveraging that curiosity and that desire to learn in somebody who is bird curious, who is a new birder, or who is a lifelong birder, but maybe hasn't known about, one particular, species conservation effort or something like that, we absolutely are doing work for the birds. As much as we know the human-related causes of bird decline, and when I look at the numbers for window strikes, when I look at the numbers for cat impact on bird mortality, I always have to go back and double check and say, wait, really? Am I right? Am I giving the right numbers? And I am. And in fact, they're probably underestimates in massive ways. But we also know the impact that humans can have on creating change. And when we look at historical accounts of species that were near the brink and we look at human efforts to bring them back to the brink, there has to be hope, there has to be optimism, as bleak as things look and feel on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, I do have one more question.
Okay, great. And then I have one for you.
I guess, what do you want people to take away from this project, whether or not they participate by leaving a story or an audio recording?
I think that each of us matters and that our relationship with birds matters and that we can be the spark for someone's lifelong love of birds is, I think, the single most important thing that I've learned from this project and that I would hope people take away. And can I ask for your Sparkbird story? Would you be willing to share that?
Sure. My Sparkbird came to me, my Sparkbird experience happened as an adult. And also I grew up around birds, but did not notice them with a sort of birding lens, whether both sight or by ear. So I was well into adulthood, and it actually started with a field guide.
Oh.
I was with a friend, and we were with our mentor, and we were talking about, I think it was the 2016 edition of Sibley's Guide to Eastern Birds. And in that edition, for the first time, the black-crowned morph of the female yellow-bellied sapsucker was included. So we were talking about yellow-bellied sapsuckers in general, and this morph in particular, and I had not seen the morph, and neither had my friend. And the next time we went out to bird in my patch, she and I saw the black-crowned morph of the female yellow-bellied sapsucker, and it felt too serendipitous to ignore. I said, well, this is certainly something that I should be spending a lot of my time doing.
That's such a wonderful moment.
Yeah.
Wow, I love that. But so many stories have sort of the opposite direction where you're out in the field and then you go to that old dusty book on the shelf that you haven't looked at for years and identify. I love this other direction. That's so beautiful.
I have to say, I totally recommend for people, I think my first bird guide, field guide, was the National Geographic Birds of North America, which is many, 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 many species, many, many of which I will probably never see. It can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I really recommend that folks kind of like narrow the field down.
Yeah.
The regional guide is really amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. It really helps.
Yeah. Well, Jenn, this has been really wonderful. This project is great, and I hope it continues to be fruitful and restorative for everyone involved. And I know I've learned a lot and will definitely be tuning into what New York State does around birds.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me, and happy birding.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Bird Story. Tune in on the second Thursday of next month for the next episode. In the meantime, explore our archives, like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Your Bird Story is edited and produced by Pod to the People. Your Bird Story is an initiative of Local Nature Lab.